In this training video, we're going to cover the credit request because the supply of that material on the purchase order was either overpriced or quantities were missing. So as we have some continuity with the invoice that we're about to post, I'm going to go in and perform the receive process on the purchase order and allow you to see the setting up of the quantities that will determine ultimately the credit request processing. So we'll assume with this purchase order for supplier CTL that we received all of the first line. We didn't receive all of the second line because there was stock damage that we won't be able to use. So we'll put in 2 units as being damaged, thereby acknowledging that yes, from your perspective as the supplier, they shipped 60, but we've only received 58 units that we can actually use. We will receive 55 of the third item. However, we will acknowledge that they also claim to have sent the lot, and we're not quite sure where the 5 went, but we didn't receive them. And the last line we'll see as fully back ordered. So they didn't ship them and we didn't receive them. That's all fine, and we will raise a back order for those items. We're also going to have a credit request for pricing, but that cannot be processed at this stage. The operator could key in information around the pricing if an invoice was accompanying the stock as opposed to a delivery docket which had no pricing, but we will leave the pricing as it stands and process that through the credit invoicing screen. So we've now received in the stock on purchase order 2067. We have a back order for the one item that we didn't receive, 20 of, and we're right to go back to our invoicing screen and now process that purchase order. The invoice screen, like all the other screens in Accrivia, requires us first to find the account we want to work with. Then we can press the invoice button to pick up the purchase order or to key in the details of our invoice. If we know the purchase order reference, we can key that in this field and press the enter key, and the system will automatically select the appropriate creditor and push us through to the next part of the process. As you can see, when I press enter, it has effectively chosen the right supplier and brought me into this part of the process where it's already loaded the purchase order. And at this point in time, we now have the purchase order information in the screen. The line is red because there is a credit request situation behind the scenes that's pending with this purchase order. If we were to load a purchase order that did not have a credit request set up behind it, the text would come in black. So we've deliberately done that so you can see easily at this point in time that over to the right, possibly depending on how your fields are laid out, is in fact a credit request amount that is building up. We can also see the comment and the reasons as to why there's a credit request building up. We clearly stipulate if there was a damage situation or a short supply situation. Here the invoice quantity is 60, but the received quantity is 55. So I'll just start that process again. The date is the date of the invoice, and the reference is the reference information on the invoice. At this point in time, you'll notice when I tabbed out of the reference field, the post button has become enabled. So there is actually enough information on this entry already to post it. But we are going to alter the stock and we are going to add a delivery line. So with regards to the stock, to see the items that have been included, we can double click on this column that says stock/details, and the system will show me the items that have been received in at warehouse level against this purchase order. I cannot change the quantities received because the warehouse has already confirmed them. If they were incorrect, you would need to go back through the inventory purchase order receive reversal process, which is found on the purchase order view screen or the purchase order maintenance screen, and go back through the receive process formally to correct any adjustments here. So as the various places in the system in terms of stock control, general ledger updates, etc. are all kept in order. The invoice rate is what they've charged us for, and the agreed rate is what we believe we should be charged. This will be coming from any agreed pricing that's been set up against this stock item for this supplier. And by default, the system will assume that they have charged you correctly. So if I was to change this line here and make it 351, you can see that the agreed rate has changed with it, assuming that they've billed us the correct amount. That may or may not be the case, and you need to be aware where you've got trading situations set up, and you would then want to override the agreed rate. Now in doing that, the credit request amount just changed because the system is now looking at the quantities of items received, in this case 58, and the difference between the invoice rate and the agreed rate, in this case 5 cents, and because we're dealing with plasterboard, the square meters on that item. If this was not a plasterboard item, then it would simply be the quantities times the difference in the rate. If we now have a look at the comment that's building up with our credit request, the comment clearly reveals the way the credit request has been built up, showing the pricing variation claim between what we have been charged and what we expected to be charged at the items received level, and we've also referenced the damaged items and the non-supplied items in terms of the price we were charged. Let's add a delivery line onto this docket. As you can see, not in red because there is no credit request associated with that line. And that brings us up to a total for our invoice. Now before pressing the post, I just want to run through the scenario that's going to unfold so there's a clear understanding of what is going to go where. We have got to put in the invoice at the invoice total from the supplier, being the 250568 in GST. However, we do not wish to pay ultimately that amount. We wish to pay $105.14 less because we want this credit request acknowledged. However, if the credit request is acknowledged, then the stock needs to go through to our warehouse at the agreed rate, not at the charged rate. We made a decision in terms of the system functionality to assume that credit requests will be granted, and we set the system up to behave in that way. In the situation where a credit request is not granted and the credit is not therefore raised, the item pricing will ultimately be higher, and you may need to handle a manual adjustment for that. The financial side will be fine because we will have already taken up the additional charge. However, the stock is going to update the average cost and last cost at the 346, the presumed rate of the credit request being successful. The reason for this is we believe operators will raise credit requests where they are quite confident they can achieve the credit request and have it become a credit note. meaning that most of the time, if you go to the effort to actually raise a request against a supplier on a pricing variation, most of the time you would do so because you're confident they have indeed overcharged you. That's a very important distinction, because in a moment when we've posted and we go and look at the actual product that was updated, you will note that the average and last cost and the stock checked into our warehouse has been done at the agreed rate, not at the invoice rate. The second distinction to note is that we don't want to update purchases ultimately with the whole amount. We want to update the purchases amount with the net result of the purchase less the credit. Again, taking the assumption the credit request will be successful. So behind the scenes, the system is linked up to a special creditor expense account. In this case, I've called it purchase pending credit request. And this represents where we will park the charge while we wait for the credit request to be approved. We won't be putting it into your purchases. Because it's still a P&L item, it'll still show up as part of your profit and loss in the cost of goods sold area. But when the credit request comes through, assuming it does, we will be clearing out this expense area with the actual credit note, meaning this becomes something of a clearing account for credit requests. Where the credit request is not accepted and a credit actually issued, the finances will stay in this account, and in that case it will act more like an expense account than a clearing account. It's up to the operator's discretion to journal that if they wish into another location, so it might go back into purchases or into an overcharge account, whatever you see fit, or you could simply leave it there. The only benefit of clearing it out would be that you'll have a better ability to treat this as a clearing account, but you could use ultimately the general ledger account reconciliation menu to actually check what has gone in and out of the GL account that is connected to this creditor expense account. Again, the same number in this occasion, 273. So let's post our invoice and then have a look at the impact throughout the system. First of all, if I go to the CTL supplier and look at the postings, we have indeed taken the invoice up for its total in its whole amount, but we've noted a comment against it that a credit request was issued. And behind the scenes, this invoice is actually on hold. We are withholding payment until the credit request is handled, be it acknowledged or revoked. Our purchases is the lesser amount of the stock, and our pricing information is as per the presumption of the credit request being granted. The values for the stock that have been now raised as a credit request have been allocated against expense account 273. There is no stock in a formal sense against this because the stock was received in on line 1. Of course, our freight and cartage line is there in its own right. If we were to look at the credit request, which has been saved into the system, what we would see is the comment has carried through from the original entry screen, but on the credit request, the stock tab indicates clearly the reason for the credits. And this really is so we can get the stationery presenting back to the supplier with a large degree of clarity, and they can see why we are requesting the credit, whether it be for short supply, damaged or not supplied, or whether it be a pricing credit. The approval of this pending credit can be actually done on this screen if the supplier grants us the credit note as per our expectations. So in that situation, I can choose to accept. The system will fill that in a moment. The posting reference would be the legitimate credit note. And the actual credit note date. Might have taken a little while, so. And the system will fill in the approval, being the user that is logged into the system at the time. And pressing post will now commit that credit request into the system as a credit note. If the request for credit is denied, we would either delete it using the delete button on this screen, or if it was partially denied, we can load our credit up in the credit note screen and make the necessary adjustments to it and finalise it.